Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure as the Minister of Justice for Asgardia to be able to welcome you all to the first in a series of webinars in which we explore critical areas of the law, justice, and regulation within the environment of space. And today, the first webinar is, I'm delighted to introduce some absolutely wonderful, extraordinary speakers, extraordinary talent from around the world. The topic today is space law, exploring the black holes, a discussion on the limitations of current space laws, treaties and accords, and what needs to be done as space becomes more commercialized. And I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they are going to talk to us today. The first, Professor Dr. Ram Jaku, DCL, who is a full professor at the Faculty of Law and acting director of the Institute of Air and Space at the world-famous McGill University in Canada. For 12 years, Dr. Ram was the project director of the world's most extensive program for space law at the Institute for Airspace and Law with a budget of over $5 million. He served as director of the Institute of Air and Space Law, faculty member and the first director of the Master of Space Studies program of the International Space University in Strasbourg, and is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Space Security. He's been involved with Asgardia since 2016 and played an active role in the drafting of its constitution. Currently, he is the project director of an international research program drafting the McGill Manual on International Law, Applicability to Military Uses of Outer Space. And recently, he initiated the curation of the McGill Encyclopedia of International Space Law. Professor Jaku, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a very kind introduction. I'm honored to be invited to be a panelist on this panel of distinguished space experts. I would like to meet all of them in person soon. Let's pray for good days. Mark, the topic which I've been...
If I may, actually, Professor, I'm going to go on to introduce the others first, and then we'll lead in, if that's acceptable to you. It is worth saying that was a précis of all of the things you've achieved. And what an impressive précis it was. The next one we'll come on is to Professor Christopher Newman, who's active in the teaching and research of space law and has published extensively on the legal and ethical underpinnings of governance as it relates to space law and otherwise. He's published numerous articles exploring the interface between ethical and legal issues within space governance, and he's presented his research to the International Institute of Space Law Symposium on the regulation of UK spaceflight and to the Committee on Space Research, Planetary Exploration Committee. So again, a précis of an extraordinary career with so many connections to space. It's wonderful to see you, Professor Newman.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to such an auspicious panel. I'm really honoured to be with everyone here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Newman. We then come on to Helen Tung, a UK barrister and consultant with over 13 years of international law experience. She studied at the International Space University and at the Delft Aerospace Engineering as part of the SSP 18 program. She is a contributor to the Courts of the Future and Space Courts in Dubai and is co-chair of the Space Debris and Space Operations at the International Aeronautical Federation and vice chair of the Enterprise Risk Management. Helen is interested in training entrepreneurs and in advising and building new spaces. Helen, it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you.
And you have a musical accompaniment behind you. You really do go with an entourage everywhere you go.
Thank you.
And if I may ask you to mute your speaker as we move on to the last but by no means the least speaker, the Supreme Justice of Asgardia, Yun Zhao. Supreme Justice Zhao is a Hong Kong lawyer specializing in space law and international economic law. He's professor and head of department of law at the University of Hong Kong and has been since 2016. He holds a PhD in international law from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. From 2013 to 2017, he held the position of director of the Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. And from 2016 to the present, he's head of the Department of Law there. On the 24th of June 2018, he was appointed as the Supreme Justice of Asgardia during the first parliamentary session in Vienna. As Supreme Justice, he supervises the operation of 4 judicial panels: a constitutional panel, a civil panel, an administrative panel, and a criminal panel. Supreme Justice, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your very kind introduction. I very much look forward to work very close with you, I think, in legal field. And of course, I think this really provides an excellent opportunity for me to exchange views with the colleagues. I think I can see very close friend, I think Professor Zhao and also Newman. So I think I'm very pleased. And also, of course, Helen, I think.
Thank you very much, Supreme Justice. And perhaps I can ask Professor Zhao to start with his thoughts on the current extent of space laws, their strengths, and perhaps their weaknesses.
Thank you, Mark. You can imagine my enthusiasm to start it. I started before you gave the introduction to my co-panelists. So, but I must say that you have given me a huge task to describe the extent of space laws and the strengths and weaknesses. I take over 100 hours to discuss what you asked me to cover in 10 minutes. So I'll try to do my best. So what I will do is give you some fundamental principles of space law, and that will serve as sort of basis for our conversation, question and answers, Okay, first of all, we should keep in mind the main purpose, which is nothing new to the panelists here from other people attending the webinar, is that the main purpose of law is to ensure smooth functioning of a society, its sustainability, and ultimate its survival. In this sense, the rule of law is to be contrasted with the rule of the jungle, in which chaos prevail and the use of force dominates human behavior. Having that in mind, so what is space law? In my simple thinking, space law is nothing but the law that governs outer space and space activities. Basically, there are 2 categories of space laws: national or domestic space laws and international space law. I do not intend to discuss domestic law. I'll concentrate mainly on international space law. We all know that outer space is an area beyond national jurisdiction, is a global commons. This means this domain is governed by international space law. From the very beginning of the spaces, back in 1957, it has been recognized that international law and the Charter of the United Nations shall apply to the space domain. Also important to keep in mind, which generally not accepted or known, that international space is embedded in international law. So the sources of international space law are essentially those of international law. So international space law is formulated exactly the same way as international law is being formulated. Since the adoption by the UN General Assembly in 1958, the first resolution related to space activities, the mandate and the jurisdiction of the international jurisdiction of the United Nations over space activity has never been changed. For space affairs, the UN General Assembly functions through its Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPIUS, and its 2 subcommittees, the Legal Subcommittee and Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Since 1950, the General Assembly has drafted and adopted 5 specific space treaties and several declarations, resolutions, and guidelines. These 5 space treaties lay down the foundation and significant principles, some of the rules of currently applicable space law. The first, perhaps the most treaty, is known as the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And I will state some of the principles included in that treaty. We should also keep in mind five space treaties are not the only treaties which govern space activities. And there are several other international treaties that have directly relevance and directly apply to space activities. Some of them are, for example, I mentioned the UN Charter, 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1978 Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, 2019 ITU Constitution and Convention Radio Regulations, and all that. So let's look, what are the basic principles which are important. The first, perhaps in my view, the most foundation, the keystone for space law is as follows. The exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and celestial bodies, must be carried out for the benefit in the interest of all countries. The exploration and use of outer space are the province of all mankind. What it means is the space activities are not within the exclusive domestic jurisdiction of any state. In other words, anyone's space activity is everyone's business. States are prohibited from placing nuclear weapons or other kinds of weapons of mass destruction in outer space or on celestial bodies. Moon and celestial bodies must be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Military activities on the moon, other celestial bodies are prohibited. Space activities must be carried in the interest of maintaining international peace and security and for promoting international cooperation and understanding. States are free to explore and use outer space and celestial bodies, including space natural resources. However, this freedom is not absolute. State must exercise such freedom without discrimination of any kind on the basis of equality and in accordance with international law. In carrying out their space activities, states are to be guided by the principle of cooperation and mutual assistance and must have due regard to the corresponding interests of other states. States, private companies, international organizations are prohibited from appropriating outer space celestial bodies, including space resources, by any means. States are internationally responsible for national activities of their own and that of their private entities. Private companies may be allowed, private companies do not have the right, but they may be allowed to carry on space activities, but only pursuant authorization and licensing and under continuous supervision of their respective states or appropriate states. A launching state is internationally liable to other states or their nationals in case the damage is caused by their space objects or the space objects of the private companies. States are required not to carry out any nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere or in outer space. States are not allowed to engage in military or any hostile use of environmental modification techniques that would have widespread and long-lasting severe effects. States are obliged to use or permit the use of radio frequencies and orbital slots in such a manner not to cause harmful interference to other states. States are obliged to maintain international peace and security and peacefully settle their disputes.
So if I may, yes. It's a very interesting thing. But one of the questions I ask, I suppose, in light of the comprehensive, already written prohibitions and on what's allowed is, are those all, in your view, enforceable? Is the weakness around enforcement of those provisions in the UN at the moment? Or because we are seeing, aren't we, talk at least of the militarization of space, and I just wonder what the strengths and weaknesses are of the current regime from your perspective.
Well, very good question. In general, international law is not enforceable, and that applies to space also. But there is a very strong mechanism for implementation or expecting the expectation through international bodies like the United Nations. Public opinion is a very important tool, but means for getting some kind of respect for enforcement of international treaties. But I will also like to add immediately, we should not expect international law totally useless. And it has been said, most of the principles, rules of international law are most often respected by most of the nations. There are exceptions. So one of that is the militarization, but that is the point I think need to be addressed carefully. What should be done about it? Okay, just only 30 seconds more. Let me tell you what is the strength. The strength is, to me, is very simple. Since the space age started, we did not have any serious problem in space. That is the strength of that. And then also, we should also keep in mind, outer space is neither a wild west nor a lawless domain. The law is there. And it is extensive, domain of law. It's there. Only thing is people do not want to know, they do not want to respect. That's a different matter. And there are specific strengths, two specific strengths in my view, is that outer space remain so far free of weapons, nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Secondly, perhaps more importantly to me, is the states remain responsible for their national activities, including those of their private citizens. That is, to me, the most important strength of space regime today. What are the weaknesses that we can say? I do not call weaknesses, I will say inadequacies, because space law still is a very solid field of law. But as anything else, things change. Law must change according to the situations. So I will very quickly point out what are the weaknesses, what are the areas which are showing inadequacy. First thing is exponential increase in space junk. That needs to be regulated more carefully. And you mentioned exponential or expanding militarization and weaponization of space. That needs to be looked at more carefully to be regulated. And I will say the third will be the current geopolitical trends towards nationalistic, competitive commercial exploitation of natural resources. I hope we do not see the repeat of global history. Fourth will be the launch of mega constellations, hundreds of thousands of satellites, to the level of what we learned recently. Rwanda wants to launch over 300,000 satellites. The fourth will be possibility of use of flag of convenience by some states. And there are other, but for me, these are the 5 areas which need to be looked at very, very, very carefully. Now, above all, the most important weakness, inadequacy of the current regime is we do not have a permanent international space organization. It is imperative to have institutions like what I said, the international organization, which we have seen like IQ and ITU. The organization will maintain the law active, alive, updated. That is to me, if I call it the weakness of the law. To conclude, I will say the compliance with the international space law, as you mentioned, Mark, earlier, is imperative not only for maintaining international peace and security, but also to encourage enhance activities for practical benefits for commercialization. So you cannot have a good commercial activity unless there's a good law. So law is imperative. And secondly, the current international space law is not outdated. And I repeat, international space law is not outdated, but it is becoming inadequate. Thus, it must be expanded, strengthened, and adapted to the evolving space activities of all countries and all stakeholders. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. And what a wonderful opening tour de force of issues, including defence and laws and enforcement and the like. Thank you very much. Perhaps I could turn now specifically to the area of space exploration and commercialisation, something we read about and watch on the TV increasingly every day. Professor Newman, is the current space regime effective when it comes to the growing exploration and commercialisation of space? And do you have any thoughts on how it might be improved?
Well, Mark, firstly, can I just say that following Professor Zhao is a little bit like turning up to a pop festival and following the Rolling Stones. I mean, that was a wonderful and passionate defense of space law. And I think actually it follows on the comments that I have to make follow on very nicely from what's already been said. I think very often space law is seen as something of an obstacle. It's portrayed as an obstacle. It's portrayed as a thing that inhibits. It's portrayed as a there's either deficiencies or there's either these things that the law doesn't allow us. And I want to challenge that narrative, because I actually think, just as Professor Zhao said, space law, it's there, it's in existence. We have sufficient laws to empower and to enable space exploration. Very often, the inhibition and the limitations on space activity are financial, not legal. They're economic. And law provides a covering blanket for that. But actually, I think of the issues that people would like to see. I think mega constellations. I see no limitations placed on mega constellations by the law. In fact, I think there are a significant amount of people who would like to see more laws inhibiting mega constellations, or at least questioning their operation and their rationale and their size. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is I would like to challenge the narrative that space law inhibits and that space law limits. I actually think it empowers. I think that a solid foundation of space law provides the commercial certainty that investors are looking for. So we have that, let's say we've got this plateau, we've got this conceptual edifice, and we call it the Outer Space Treaty. It's not meant to provide granular detail. It's not meant to provide the operations manual for how we do this. That's left up to states. Individual states are allowed to then determine how they manage their space activity. So I think the question then turns to what exactly are the gaps? What exactly are the issues that we need to look at? And I've identified a few of them. I think, and it's something that you touched upon in the discussion with Professor Zhao, accountability and accountability for actions is a process that hasn't really been built into the treaty. We've got areas where we know states are accountable. Article 6, international responsibility for national space activity. We know that states are responsible for authorizing and continually supervising their non-governmental entities. So we know that's an area that states should be doing it. But beyond that, there's no description of what that should look like. Each state has its own interpretation. Now, maybe that's quite rightly so, as it allows for different states to evolve in different fashions. But I do think, as Professor Zhao said, that an international institution, which even if it only calibrates what regulators are up to, even if it only provides a clearinghouse for, this country is doing this, what are you doing in terms of regulation? So that we can draw a picture of really good practice. I think that's a really important enabler of space law within national jurisdictions that can then feed up to becoming normative behaviour, that can then feed into our understanding of what the principles of the Outer Space Treaty are going to look like. So I think that's the first area I would look at. The second issue, I think we've got a mismatch, and it's something I find as an academic. There's a mismatch between the speed that industry works, the speed that academia works, and the speed that institutions work at. And I think that can sometimes be frustrating, especially for industry. But I think there has to be a recognition that there is this different track of activity, and there are broader considerations. States have to be cognizant of broader considerations. They have to consult with stakeholders. They have to take account of just more than tomorrow's project. And so I think, again, there has to be management of expectations. An international body, I think, would do that. Then I think we've got the issue of space traffic management, actually coordinating what's going on in the orbital regime. And I'm going to take a step back from that. I think what we need at the minute are minimum standards for what we track. And minimum standards for actually, what is the minimum we should expect in terms of space tracking from a nation, from a company, from an organization. Because I think that type of calibration and that type of looking across various jurisdictions and establishing what's going on, I think is going to be really valuable. I think once we get that tracking and once we start really understanding the orbital environment, then we'll be able to start looking at managing it better. And then we'll be able to look at what works and what doesn't. So I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour there. Professor Jack has already touched on flags of convenience. And I think, again, that feeds back to my first point of, I really think there should be some international calibration of regulatory practices to prevent this, this notion of forum shopping and flags of convenience. Because again, what we want is a race to the top. We want a race to who is the best regulator rather than who is the most amenable regulator. So I'll stop there and hopefully that's given some insight.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Newman. Yes, absolutely right. And could you just explain a little bit, perhaps with a practical example of the flags of convenience point? How would that apply to the commercialization of space, for example?
So I won't name any states, but let's just say I am a private company in state A. And I go to my regulator. Now, my regulator is known for being rigorous. It charges a large fee. It makes sure that each space object is registered rather than just registering a constellation. So there's a bit of expense. I have to prove that I've got a viable project. I have to prove, perhaps most important of all, that I've got, for example, post-mission disposal of each of the satellites, that I've considered the orbits that I'm looking at, that I've considered frequency and spectrum, and that I'm not, causing interference. And generally that I've got a well thought through project that survives rigorous examination, that survives rigorous, cross-examination, that is, financially viable, and that I'm, as a company, am not going to go bankrupt within the next 3 or 4 months, leaving a load of satellites floating around up there with no accountability. That's state A. State Y, for example, state Y, if I go to state Y and I invest heavily in that economy and provide some, set up an office there and perhaps provide some incentives, they will then be more amenable to my project. They may waive, for example, the charge. They may be happy to authorize the constellation. They may be happy to authorize it with slightly less rigorous examination. So I think the real danger is what we want states to look towards A. We want states to pride themselves on the rigor of their regulation. We want them to ensure that actually when they are overseeing space activity, the rush for commercialization doesn't trample over considerations of the space environment, international cooperation, the use and the fair use of frequency, and the broader husbandry and care that we take of the space environment.
Thank you very much for that. And, we've seen that, haven't we, with regulators around the world coming together, whether it's INSOL or IOSCO or whatever it might be. Regulators come together and they say, let's work on a set of standards from which each nation can deviate if it wishes. But to join the club, the elite club, one needs to sign up to a certain minimum standard. And I suppose the challenge might well be that, historically, when the world was globalizing, getting unity from nations around these principles was not easy, but perhaps more accessible, which is why I suppose the 1967 space treaty was so broadly accepted within the UN. Since then, though, it seems to have got harder and harder to get, let's say, the key nations when it comes to states to agree anything. And I wonder, Helen, if you might talk to whether you see that challenge as continuing to increase, or whether, for the reasons that Professors Zhao and Newman have enunciated, the world is moving towards states wanting to agree a higher form of regulation.
So I probably sort of look at it slightly differently, primarily because I'm sort of more in the seat with the entrepreneur and trying to enable them with their technologies and how to get them off the ground than the other way. And a bit of background is I helped draft some of the regulations on autonomous shipping and collision avoidance, which is very similar, I think, in terms of space traffic management. So one of the things I would say is commercialization of space for me is a godsend and a blessing in disguise, in the sense that it's finally time that we engage with other actors apart from the state actors to try and go to space. I agree there are certain points about responsibility and all that comes in, which is really important. But I'm also very mindful that whatever laws and regulations that come to play, it shouldn't stifle innovation. And I've seen how what I initially proposed in maritime has in essence done somewhat of damage in that sense. So I wouldn't use the word necessarily regulation so strongly. I would use maybe guidance at this point, because it's a chicken and egg situation. If I look at leadership, I would use Luxembourg as a very good example. They didn't wait. They didn't go through what would be expected of them, which is, go through the EU channels of introducing certain laws, specifically in mining. They went straight for it and passed it through their own parliament and made it law. And what we saw from that, observing what's happened over the last few years, and I was very fortunate to be in Luxembourg before and after, and also know some space startups before and after in fundraising, is that in entrepreneurship speech, we say, if you want to go fast, you do it alone. If you want to, sort of do it, properly with the whole lot, then you basically partner up with people. I was going to say gang up, partner up with people. And I want to say that Luxembourg was very, I think, strategic in the sense that they were able to grasp a handful of very good startups from the get-go. So what's happening as a trend is a lot of countries right now is in essence enticing talent around the world to get the best entrepreneurs away from the traditional state actors like the US, perhaps even Russia. If you look at Australia, for instance, if you look at South Africa, if you look at even, tiny countries like, New Zealand is a beautiful country, let's say, but, they're doing that. The UK is also, in Harwell, also, developing a lot of initiatives. So everyone is not trying to grab a slice of it in the sense of, we're up there in space. They're trying to get hold of the talent. And let's talk about the UAE. They recently launched a whole, I think, 10,000 visa on coders. Now, why is that important? Because everyone is appreciating, for example, traditionally one might say, well, money is the most important thing that goes around and, pays for what's worth. But now it's knowledge. Knowledge is power. Technology is power. So I will confess, I think I'm of that generation that still use Blackboard and, chalk as education. But the new generation, particularly the post-COVID generation, they're going to be coding. They're going to be speaking in a different language. And so this is where there's a catch to all of this. So I put on the futurist hat and I say the future of human spaceflight and future travel is not going to be humans. It's going to be robots. It's going to be our avatars. And then you get into the whole conversation of metaverse. Now, it becomes very interesting. So imagine for a moment, on Earth, we have laws, we have regulations. We are limited by what our country says we can or can't do. In space, it's an open domain. So it's not, I don't want to say it's free for all, but to a certain extent it is. Because if you think of why Luxembourg was so ahead of its time is, in theory, yes, under UNOSA Outer Space Treaty, any state that attempts to mine resources, it should not be entitled to it because it's basically for the benefit of humankind. However, it doesn't say anything about private actors. So a private company who is so successful goes up to an asteroid or Mars or Moon, does end up bringing resources back to Earth. You can just imagine, of course, the kind of outcry the environmental groups will have. The states will try and do something about it, the lobbyists. But you have you kind of, it's like two sides of the same coin. You know, you want to go out and explore the universe. I mean, we're humans, so we do have that natural tendency. But then, how do we do it responsibly with foresight and all that? And that's where I say lawyers need a proactive approach. So I've been very vocal about getting lawyers actively engaged. But part of the difficulty is our own profession. So whilst it's very difficult to get into law school, and then, we are trained and then we become experts in our fields, we no longer become creative individuals. I mean, for example, Asgardia is almost like a platform to dream, and all this. But you will find that a lot of lawyers are very scared of even, brainstorming out loud what the future could be. Or they might even say, well, this is not my remit. But this is where in essence, I don't want to say wrong, but in essence, this is where there's a golden opportunity for the next generation of lawyers. So, it's quite, I'll give you a really good example. And this is how we met, right, Mark, when I got into legal tech and AI, I remember one of the top 4 companies, they contacted me to say, Helen, we would love your opinion because a no-name firm wants your expertise. I said, okay, so this no-name firm is probably advising clients, charging clients through the nose for my expertise, which they probably don't want to recognize. Now, why is that? Because it's a controversial opinion. But then what you saw was a lot of law firms realize, oh, heck, we need to get on top of it. So let's get the brains in. So let's get the entrepreneurs in. So what I want to say is actually I'm happy for the entrepreneur to guide us and say, okay, what do you think technologically we need to get to space and, let's say, mine the resources and add the element of corporate responsibility? Then it's for the lawyers to work with them hand in hand to navigate the landscape, not unilaterally, but as a team. So I think public-private partnerships will be increasingly important. So on the theme of military domain, so I was actually at
Helen,
NATO.
If I could just pause there for a second, because what I think I'm hearing from you is an alternative view, perhaps, which is, if the world strives to come together to achieve a very high level of regulation, that may stifle the very innovation which is going to drive, access and exploration and commercialization of space. And is that also wrapped around your view that getting international accords is getting harder, and therefore perhaps a more decentralized view is better? Or do you actually think that it is possible to get a greater international collaboration?
Yes, so I want to mention that, of course, law and regs are irrelevant, but it's the timing as well. So when a market is not mature and you try to put stringent or very, fine, like a fine line on the laws, it basically disempowers the entrepreneur to be creative because you're already setting the parameters of what we don't know. I wanted to touch about NATO and the Southern Hub, which I recently attended literally like last week. And it was NATO that got in touch and said, hey, we need, SME experts here to talk to us about, space from a commercial point of view, because we want to understand it from a perhaps defense point of view, which is fair enough. And what was surprising is they realized they can't go it alone. They can't do it alone. They actually need to understand what is the reality on the ground with the commercial sector. What is it about space? And to be honest with you, I think one of the challenges for entrepreneurs is it's always about due use. I've been working previously on a startup where that was one of the biggest questions. Who is going to be our customer? Is it going to be the private, public, or is it actually going to be a state sector? And what is interesting is probably I would say maybe 8% of the startups that I've engaged with, they do public-private business, but it's not, and it's actually quite open. For example, some of the digital imagery like Planet, they don't do they do amazing digital imagery based on what they've got, but it's not as sharp precision as, say, the military. But they sell it. They offer it as services to the private sector and the military sector for the usage. And it's no secret about it. And one of the biggest challenges I would say is insurance, because I was in Japan to try and help. I was funded by the European Commission and also the ministry in Japan. How do you double the space sector? And it was such an interesting conversation because you go with the old network, as it were, or I call it, traditional space actors like Mitsubishi and whatnot, Nissan. And one of the engineers said to me, former chief engineer said to me, Helen, how am I supposed to convince a client to go with this no-name new space startup? And this is where I tell you my inspirational story about SpaceX, okay? How did Elon Musk get his first contract? Okay, I'll tell you the story. And this is from ISU lectures, by the way. So there was a Korean-American lawyer who actually gave Elon Musk his first contract at NASA. And that was what really woke me up to the role of a lawyer in space. How the story goes is, imagine you're a lawyer, you've got a lot of proposals coming in from the traditional space actors, and you've got this no-name company from this no-name guy called Elon Musk who wants to basically launch vehicles up in space for cheaper, faster cost. And so this Korean-American lawyer made a conscious decision to say, I'm going to submit this proposal to management and give him a try because I've never heard of him. Maybe he can deliver. And when I heard that story, it totally inspired me as the lawyer thinking, how can I play a role? And my whole thing, well, in terms of what I'm trying to do is, yes, the law is absolutely important, but I would say the end users even more so. The end users being Joe Bloggs down the road, who is using his mobile phone, which is a space technology, by the way, and everyone else, because once we have the people realizing that space is no longer limited to the elites, as you were to say, but to everyday individuals, they have a voice. They are also entitled to have their say as to what they think future space travel, space use ought to be. And this is where, coming to the cause, obviously it's a recognition that space is now being or slowly heading towards perhaps commercialization. There are a lot of factors, including transparency, including space resources that need to be, discussed and dealt with. And this is where the beauty comes in. Yes, democratization is a huge word, which is used in blockchain and also used in the younger generation, I call it. And so, yes, I think definitely. But you see, you're not going to get people engaged if they are fearful that they can't contribute.
We'll come back to it. But I think the key message there is, be careful of over domestic regulation for fear of affecting an entrepreneurial commercialization and the benefits it may give to mankind. And that brings us perfectly on, if I may say so, to Supreme Justice Zhao. Having heard all of this, Supreme Justice, what role do you think Asgardia has in defining accords or parameters that both promote the exploration and commercialization of space, but also promote very high regulatory standards to protect space?
Thank you, Mark. I think, Helen, have you finished what you would like to share on your part? So I think I'll just continue, with what you have just mentioned, actually. I think space technology, no doubt, changing our life, changing our world, rapidly, in the last few decades. And now, I think space commercialization and privatization are well underway. As Professor Ramjaku has mentioned, the major conventions were made in the 1960s to 1970s, well before space commercialization came up. States at that time were traditionally the only player in the space field. However, starting from the 1980s, space is not only monopolized by the states. More and more commercial entities and private entities are involved in the space activities. Space commercialization has thus pushed, to the forefront the diversification of the space players, which is beneficial to the international community as a whole. Space commercialization was led by, for example, in the 1980s, telecommunication services and remote sensing services. However, we are now moving to a new stage, and we can explore the role Asgardia can play in the process of space commercialization. Asgardia, as a first space nation, will no doubt put emphasis in the space commercialization in the era of a space economy. There are several areas that I think, or I believe, that Asgardia can take a leading role. First of all, I think actually Helen has also mentioned about the space resource utilization, space mining. I think this is a really interesting areas. And of course, it has now become a very hot topic. The issue has been under discussion on various platforms, including the Hague Working Group, UN Corpus, etc. But if we really examine the ways to move forward, actually, I think if we look at the United States, Luxembourg, or at the national level, I think we do find some unilateral approach to deal with the space resource utilization or space mining. But at the same time, we can see also some bilateral approach to deal with the space mining. I think that means the United States has also came up with some bilateral agreements to sign with the UK, with Japan, with other countries. Much the same way as the ISS, in the 1980s, when the United States, in building or setting up the International Space Station to reach the intergovernmental agreement, IGA. That's a unilateral, bilateral, I think is quite clear. But of course, we cannot forget about the multilateral approach. I think, of course, we also talk about the international collaboration, international cooperation, which Professor Lam Chaku, definitely agrees. I think one very important principles that have been put down in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, international cooperation in outer space. And this principle was put forward as early as 1958, the UNGA resolution. So we basically have a full pictures or comprehensive pictures about ways to come up with a regulatory regime for space resource mining, unilateral, bilateral, multilateral. Unilateral is done mainly through domestic legislation, which Asgardia can do on its own, which is, of course, very important to sustainability of Asgardia in various aspects, including social, economic, financial viability. Bilateral approach would also be good through the reaching agreements with relevant countries, but the negotiation process may be long, much too long probably. Multilateral approach will of course pose difficulties. With more countries involved in the process, it will prove to be rather difficult, and of course I will take much more efforts, to come up with something. But of course, there's no harm in being involved in this process. Well, I think if we really look from other perspective, it might be useful if some documents like accords or something similar to group together the commercial entities that engage in space resource utilization. I think this could be something very similar to the IATA. I think the airline private companies, they get together, to come up with some association to make rules. We are not talking about the agreements at the governmental level. I think we probably look at users level. I think like Helen has mentioned about the end users. Actually, end users need to have some say in the development of the legal regime or of the regulatory regime. So the voice from these entities would be very important, as they will be the real players in the field. Another area I'm thinking, probably is the space tourism. Similar to the regime, again, in the civil aviation, we might consider some organization or associations for potential actors to be involved, to work together, to shape the future growth of the safe, secure, and sustainable space travel industry. Several aims or targets for space travels include, safety, to build consumer confidence, in particular in the early days of the space travel. I think that's exactly the same story. In the 1929 or 1930s, we do need to provide a regime which will not be too restrictive, allowing the development of civil aviation. I think now we could also consider some private actors to be involved in come up with some regime amongst themselves to promote or to facilitate the development of space tourism or space travel. Of course, I think in this way, we also will have to think about environmental sustainability, financial resilience to secure government relief measures for the entity to develop and thrive in the market. So that means at the government level, Asgardia, of course, can do a lot, including making legislations, trying to negotiate with other countries. These are viable ways, but at the same time, we also need to look at the private entities. We should engage them to involve them in the whole process, in the regulatory regime, through a rule-making process. Through this way, I'm sure that Asgardia will be in the best position to really make useful contributions to the development of the space activity, space commercialization and privatization. So I think Professor Yakub has raised hands. I think probably I have to stop here and to see your comments. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to say that. I was saying after you end. Mark, I wonder if I can make a comment.
With pleasure, Dr. Yak.
Right. First thing, I am really, really delighted to hear different perspectives, both from Newman and Ms. Tong, and of course, my good friend, Yunyo. I feel very much energized and happy. I think I was a bit more structured because I didn't know what kind of format it will be. I think I'd love to have it. Of course, the time is very short. But I want to add a few sentences, ideas. They are linked, but I can't explain everything. First thing is, I think it is said, those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat. Okay? And I think it tells you everything what is going on. All right? And the second thing is, commercialization is not a goal, it's a means. Let's not get bogged in the means and forget the goal. Goal is for the benefit of humanity. If I understand, when we were working on the Constitution of Asgardia, my thinking and the people who were thinking was, we are not talking about petty minor things here. We are looking at humanity from outside. Right? So that is what is seen. The third thing is there's a fundamental difference between exclusive interests and inclusive interests. The question here is, in law, private law cannot trump public law. Private interests should not be allowed to kill the public interest. That's what you see. Fourth thing is, we must not look at the analogies. What is good in Earth does not mean it's good in space. Here on Earth, the shortest distance between 2 points is straight line. In space, it's a semicircle. Nuclear radiation on Earth, even nuclear radiation on Earth will still remain to certain confined area possibility. Small radiation in space will damage the whole universe around Earth. So our thinking has to be global. Going there. If I bring $1 trillion industry to this company or this country, and I say, well, space law does not apply to this planet. This is wrong. And Professor Newman said brilliantly, law is there to protect everybody for individually in there. If you just imagine one person on the road does not respect the law, it blocks the road, end of the story. I think fundamental thinking has to be whose interest we are talking about, who is there. Public and private partners have to be absolutely in bed. And that was done, and so Zhao mentioned very brilliantly, establishment of intercept system. Most successful international organization, company, successful for benefit of everybody. Sad thing, it was privatized because it was too successful. Public and private partnership is necessary for benefiting every individually and that kind of. Those are very, I think we cannot get into discussion on that. I think it's too much. To me, I think perhaps the most important thing to me, we should think globally. Small companies, some countries can do that. But again, I think that is where, if we want to survive, I'm not saying sustaining. Honestly, I'm worried that Mark said it very I'm worried about the survival of this planet. And only this planet can be. We are going to go space, but we are already closing the door. The debris is so much, in 10 years, forget about space tourism, will not be in a position to go. So question is, today I make extra money and that kind of thing. I think we have to be thinking a little bit in a broader sense. That I'm sorry I took more than 2 minutes, but I think
can I come back on that point about for the benefit of humankind? So what's interesting is actually we're on the same page. When we talk about the world, half the world doesn't have internet usage, and that's related to satellite access and also mobile phones. When we talk about space debris, Astroscale is one of the first private sector companies that's focusing on that. So I think maybe, yes, commercialization in essence, it's not purely working on for the benefit of mankind, but it doesn't say it's not aspirational. And it's an interesting discussion because mining, you could even argue, is not sustainable. Neither is it necessary for the benefit of humankind. But maybe we're looking at, well, what are the uses for and how can we make it more sustainable? That's also an interesting discussion. I mean, I appreciate that there's not an easy answer to it. And, the definitions of what it means is also really important. And how does one mitigate? It's like we didn't start from day one realizing that air travel would cause so much emissions. COVID-19 studies have then made us realize that. And of course, as humans, we then realize, okay, we have to learn from our mistakes as we go along and how we mitigate. And now there's a whole different discussion about net zero. And so I think, we're being conscious, I think, in the discussions, and the more voices we have probably would also allow us to see things, that we maybe haven't seen and from the different angles as well. Yeah. Thank you.
That's smashing.
Let me just sorry.
If I may, moderate.
Let me make the mess. First, let me make the mess. Then you pay me to clean up that mess. And by that time, after clearing a mess, I will declare bankruptcy.
Yeah, so actually it's a good point because space, sorry, just one point.
Time is short. Enough.
The items up in space are not commercial assets right now at this point. So I want to be able to defend the private sector before they've even started.
We're already, if I may say so, a couple of minutes beyond, and we could discuss the environment all day. But what I will do, I suppose, is to attempt to sum up what we heard today from Professor Zhao was that there are plenty of good laws that exist and the purpose of them. We heard from Professor Newman of the significance and the importance of the international community coming together to have the highest standards possible. We heard from Ms. Tong about the importance of not stifling innovation. And we heard some good ideas, if I may say so, from the Supreme Justice about ways in which, both from a unilateral and a multilateral basis, Asgardia might play a critical role in the development of those regulatory rules that promote innovation whilst at the same time ensure high standards. I think it was a really valuable discussion. If I may ask each candidate, and I'll start, Professor Newman, with you, if I may, for your 1 or 2 lines in summary of the discussion and any final comments you've got.
Well, as Professor Zhao said, I feel really energized. What a great discussion and great panel to have together. I feel genuinely privileged to be part of it. I think in summary, very simply, there is an inherent tension between what the private sector wants to do and what the international community should allow the private sector to do. And I think that's what we're dancing around, that balance between the need for the private sector, as Helen said, to go off and do things, and as Param said, to be held into account. And I think that's what we're searching for at the minute, that balance, that tipping point, where it's acceptable to let people go and do things, but also to make sure that the needs of the many are not completely ignored in the rush to make money. So I think that's probably where I would conclude.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I would say great opportunities also lead to great responsibilities. And so I think that's also something where, as lawyers, we can also come into play and when we guide guide the clients as well. And actually, and engaging more lawyers interested in space would be sort of a top priority as well, because we can't do it alone. We don't have the answers. And I think this is where, brilliant minds can come together and have those, discussions to flesh out scenarios and take it one step at a time, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Professor Jaffe?
I cannot say more eloquently than Professor Newman, so I agree with him. Balance of interest, that was the message given by the US delegate who negotiated Outer Space Treaty. Balance of interest, that is what is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final word to Supreme Justice Zhao.
Thank you. I think my message will be very direct, straightforward. I think space commercialization and privatization is the future, is a irreversible change. So Asgardia will be in the ideal position to look into the opportunities. We cannot lose the opportunity. Asgardia can have a very important role to play. This role should be the leading role, I think, not only as a nation, but also, I think, to look into the private field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody for a fascinating webinar, the first in a series that will be hosted by the Ministry of Justice. I thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Insightful. I think we covered a lot of ground and we came to a very solid conclusion. So thank you all very much.